Their last meal together is finished. And so Jesus walks out of the upper room to go down to a neighboring garden with Peter and the brothers Zebedee. I am deeply grieved, Jesus says to them, even to death. Remain here. Stay awake with me. And then Jesus walks a short distance before the anguish, the pain, the certainty of suffering that he will experience overcomes him, and he drops to the ground. His sweat and tears drop from him like blood. Abba, he prays, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. His agony over what he knows awaits him in just a few short hours is so intense, it is almost more than he can face. And yet, at this same moment, his friends who came to the garden with him and who had all said, yes, yes, we will be able to drink the cup that you are drinking, are all sleeping. They could not stay awake. They could not be watchful or even be aware of all that Jesus is experiencing. In the darkness of the garden, when Jesus needed their comforting embrace or just simply their presence, they deserted him for sleep. Jesus picks up the cup he is about to drink. In this moment of abandonment, he holds the cup tightly and then he looks deeply into it, into all the sorrow, all the bitterness, all of the life that he will swallow. And Jesus cries out, Abba, if it's possible, let this cup pass me by. But we know it will not. We know he will experience life-draining suffering because we see him on a cross. We hear him crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we hear in his crying out the psalmist's lament, that psalmist's lament. And we hear the echoes of all human suffering in it. I know I heard that same lament one hot, clammy day in 1969 on a street in Biloxi, Mississippi, where I was stationed in the Air Force. Hurricane Camille had roared through town, destroying buildings, destroying homes and roads, and shattering the lives of the people in that city. And I was sweeping up the debris on one of the residential streets as part of a cleanup effort when I heard sobbing just a few yards from where I stood. And as I came closer, I heard the sobbing with every stroke of the broom. A stick-thin man, tightly clutching himself, sat rocking back and forth on a pile of rubbish that had once been his home, sobbing uncontrollably. Why? Why, oh Lord, did they all have to die? And we hear this same lament in the stories filling the pages of Jonathan Causel's book, Amazing Grace, that chronicles the lives of children living in the South Bronx, one of the poorest, most dangerous areas in our nation. A place where 15-year-old Isabel describes as not like being in jail, but it's more like being hidden. It's as if you have been put in a garage where if they don't have room for something and they aren't sure they should throw it out, well, that's where they go and they put it out there in the garage so they don't have to think about it any longer. Can you imagine what it feels like to think that you are nothing more than one unwanted stuff put out of sight so it can be put out of mind. And we hear this lamenting cry, also echoing in the grieving wail of Palestinian mothers and fathers, and Israeli mothers and fathers, Iraqi mothers and fathers, Darfur mothers and their children, Sri Lanka children left orphaned by war, American mothers and fathers mourning the deaths of their sons, their daughters, their parents, their families. We hear it in the stories of children chained to floors in India and made to weave rugs that will be sold in New York City and Des Moines, Iowa, and Rochester. And we hear it in the stories of young girls and boys and women kidnapped by human traffickers. We heard it just this last week in the cries of students and parents in Ohio. We heard it in the cries of men and women and children in Kentucky, in Indiana, and South Carolina. And we heard it in the neighbors of the 4 children who died in a house fire on Grape Street in Rochester. And finally, Jesus is crying out that psalmist's lament, "Why have you forsaken me?" Also pushes us to be deeply aware of our own sorrows, our own loneliness, our own broken lives, alienation, career confusion, wounds, pain-filled diseases, losses, unfinished grieving, unfulfilled need for affirmation and belonging. Every one of us here this morning has experienced sorrow. Some of us are experiencing sorrow. And some of us will be experiencing sorrow in the tomorrows of our lives. Sorrow is at once intensely personal and at the same time universal. For as we look upon the man hanging on the cross with outstretched arms, we realize Jesus is not alone on the cross. Because, as Henry Nouwen reminds us, it is also us, the whole human race, people of all times and all places, uprooted from the earth as a spectacle of agony, who are hanging on the cross with Jesus. That is one part of the meaning of Jesus' words, "When I am lifted up from the earth, I shall draw all people to myself." So it is not only Jesus, the man of sorrows, hanging on the cross, but it is we, the humanity of sorrows, hanging with him, hanging between heaven and earth with all that is Christ-like within us, being crucified and suffering and crying out, my God, why have you forsaken us?" When we lift up the cups of our lives and hold it as Jesus held the cup of his life, it appears to be filled to the brim with physical and mental and spiritual anguish. And we hear Jesus' question, "Can you drink this cup?" And what we really want to say is, "Please, just let it pass by me. Thank you very much." We can just put all the sorrow out in the garage and forget about it, can't we? Can't we just turn on the television or the internet and be entertained into mind-numbing vegetative state with sitcoms and unreal reality shows? Can't we just turn away from this sorrow and deny it exists so that we can think happy, anesthetized thoughts? Can't we just do that? Truth is, nope, we cannot. This is the cup of life, our life, a life that we must live, a life we must think about and reflect upon. one we must have some opinions about, discuss, and contemplate. As one philosopher has said, the unexamined life is a life not worth living. And intuitively, we know that that's true. We know living life mindlessly and aimlessly is not enough. We must know what kind of life we are living. We know we must look at our life critically. Because if we fail to do so, we lose the vision of what makes our life significant. We lose the meaning our life has. We lose the value our life has for us and for everyone we are connected to, our families, our friends, our community. But holding this cup of life and peering deeply into it, it is hard. And it demands great courage. I mean, even Jesus finds it hard to do. Even Jesus needed help beyond his sleepy disciples. See, Jesus does not rely on his own willpower and determination to drink this cup of sorrow. Rather, he, like the psalmist, relies upon the one with whom he shared a bond of love that could not be broken. The one with whom he possessed an intimate trust beyond betrayal, beyond surrender, beyond despair. A love that is beyond all fears. The bond of love that he had with the one whom he called Abba. And it is this intimacy, beyond all human intimacy, as Henry Nouwen writes, that made it possible for Jesus to turn the request to let the cup pass him by be a prayer directed to the one who called him my beloved. Despite all the anguish that he felt at that moment, this bond of love was there. It was there beyond all feelings and all thoughts, and it maintained a communion, a unity of being one beyond all disruptions. And it is this intimate communion that made him grasp the cup and pray, "Let it be as you, not I, would have it. Let it be thy will that is done." Doing so as an act of trust in God. Jesus does not throw away the cup out of hopelessness. Instead, he grasped it and drank it to the bottom out of a deep, "Yes, I will drink it," to God, the one who loves all wounded hearts, and the one whom Jesus knew would hear him and act to be with him. As Luke tells us, God sends an angel to give Jesus strength and comfort, which is what God does with all of us as well. And that's really the affirmation of the psalmist in Psalm 22. Because it's very easy to stop at the very first few lines of Psalm 22 and think, well, that's all there is to it. This is just a psalm of lament and suffering. Particularly since Jesus utters those first few lines on the cross. But that's not what that psalm is about. And when we look at that psalm in its entirety, and now I'm going to invite you to be a little interactive, and that's to pick up your pew Bible and open it to Psalm 22. Raise your hands when you're there, so I will know we're set. And when you get there, just raise your hand. And when I see most of the hands up, then we'll continue. We good to go? We there? All right. Now, here's what I would like you to do. Go to verse 21, and I want you to look at the space between the line, "Save me from the mouth of the lion," and the line, "From the horn of the wild oxen you have rescued me." Everyone there? Got that space? That space is there intentionally. Because it is in that space that God has acted to transform the psalmist's life. Now, we don't know what God did. But we, and maybe the psalmist, doesn't really care what God did. What is important is that God did something. God acted to transform the psalmist's life of pain and sorrow into a new life of joy and peace, which he sings about in the remaining verses of Psalm 22. You see, Psalm 22, like nearly every one of the Psalms of lament, and there are only 2 Psalms of the lament that do not do this, only 2. Every other Psalm of lament ends in resurrection, ends in praising God for transforming their life for the better. You see, sorrow is not all our life is about. Pain and suffering are not the final answer, because the Lord of life will act to turn our sorrow into joy, our mourning into dancing. One of the great blessings of trusting God to act in our lives, to transform our life situations, is knowing that, because that frees us to embrace our sorrows as part of our life. And it also allows us to be free, to be empowered to see our sorrows in a different light, because we can then see within them the possibility of transformation, see within them the seed of a new and different life. After all, doesn't the husk of a seed need to be broken before the green shoot comes forth? Doesn't the cocoon need to be torn apart so that the butterfly might emerge? Doesn't the darkness need to be pierced so the light of a new and completely different day might dawn? And isn't that what faith, what trusting God means?